Hi, I'm Mellisa Smith.
I'm Serena Halstead.
And I'm Spencer Ziegler, and welcome to Data Lit. And we're in the middle of our Working with Data series. So far, we've covered the main data literacy skills, reviewed the different data types, and discussed how to talk about data. Now, today we're going to tackle just how do you overcome the obstacles that might be preventing teachers from using the data. And for this, I got a question for you two. It might seem random, but I'm going somewhere with this, so bear with me. But how's your sleep in general?
I'm sleep deprived.
Yeah, having young kids will do that. What about you, Mellisa?
I think I'm sleep deprived. I have this weird sleeping pattern that I haven't lost, even though I haven't been in the classroom for a while, that I still can't seem to go to sleep prior to midnight. Because when I was teaching, I had to do all the sort of things. And then before I knew it, I couldn't sleep before midnight. And that's when I was doing all my planning. So I just can't seem to sleep before midnight.
Yeah, and I too sometimes struggle with sleep. Now, part of this is all of us have young kids. That's going to contribute.
Yes.
Yeah. But even before then, I've always been like a tough sleeper. And I was thinking, there are ways probably for me to analyze what's going on and how to improve my sleep. But for some reason, I've just never really looked at the data of my sleep. Just looking at that data, what is actually important and what is just kind of noise. I've never really taken the time to dig through it because I've always had, being slightly nerdy, I've always had, Fitbits and those kind of things there. So I have the data.
There's no slightly nerdy, right? There's either you are or you aren't.
Yeah, and we all know which side of that barrier I'm on.
Just want to put that out.
Yeah. But I've never gone through and actually looked and done stuff with the data, figure out what's important, what's not, taking the time and figure out what to actually do about it. So that got me kind of thinking of today's episode of just those same three obstacles, figuring out the noise and the signal, taking the time and determining what are the actual next steps. I think those are facing teachers as well and preventing them sometimes from really grappling with the data.
Okay.
So instead of us just pitching problems, but then not doing anything with them, we wanted to take a little bit of time to discuss potential solutions for each of these obstacles.
Okay.
And Serena, I think you're taking the first one. What do you got for us?
All right. So one of the first obstacles that we talked about here is signal and noise. And so I was reading this article. The title of the article is by Brian Godwin. And it says, mindsets are key to effective data use. And so in the article, he mentioned that a recent survey of 4,600 teachers found that teachers are overwhelmed with so much information that it is difficult to separate the signal from the noise. So getting all of that different types of data, we have the perception data, we have the demographic data, we have the academics data, the student outcomes data, but getting all of that, it's a lot of signal. There's a lot of noise in it as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Mellisa. Signal and noise. What do we do with that?
So for me, when I think of how do you sort of deal with an overwhelming amount of data and sort of figure out which one to pay attention to, over the years, I figured out that I pay attention to the one that will give me the most bang for my buck at the point in time that I'm looking. And in everyday teaching, when you sit back at the end of the day and reflect, it's really my formative assessment.
Yep.
So I kind of use that. I pay the most attention to my formative assessment data and then any other data after that. And so I try to use that lens of what will give me the most bang for the buck type of approach in terms of determining, how do you figure out the signal versus all of the noise of the data.
I like that because the more narrow the data is, the easier it's going to be to kind of figure out what that signal is. So the formative assessment, oftentimes it might just be one or two standards. So it's going to be simpler for you to then realize, okay, where should I focus then on those standards?
Correct.
Whereas if you're waiting to analyze data until you have the summative assessment, which is looking at 15 standards.
Or even a benchmark, yeah.
Yeah, that's where it can be trickier. And also this can build on itself. If you've already looked at some of that formative assessment data, that will probably make it easier for you as a teacher to figure out what to do with that summative assessment when it does come around, to kind of filter out some of that noise.
Yeah.
And that part about the noise, it becomes noise if the teacher doesn't have a strategy to deal with it. So the students are not performing, but then you don't have a strategy to use, or you have a strategy and it's not working, but you're being told to continue using the strategy. And so when you get the data becomes noise to you because you know that what you did, the strategy wasn't working, but you continue using it. So you're just looking at the data like, see, I told you, right? So that's where that noise come into when you're no strategy or you're using a strategy that you know is ineffective.
Yeah, and I think we just get a lot of noise in our data now that we're in this pandemic because there's so many other variables and factors that might impact the data. And that just makes it all the tougher to kind of separate that signal and the noise. And this is something that we, the data research and accountability, we put together an office hours session that's been recorded that talked about how to address this particular problem. So it was on September 21st from this year. And you can access that at www.wcpss.net/DRA office hours. We'll include that in the show notes today. So that'll give you some resources for how to deal with the noise for the pandemic-related data that we're going to get. Mellisa, what was the second obstacle that we're going to talk about today?
The second obstacle, which probably should be the first, second, and third obstacle, is the one about time, right? And so in that EdNC survey, they surveyed over 800 teachers, and they found that 54% or more than half of the respondents said that the lack of time to use data effectively is probably the biggest obstacle they face in using data to inform teaching practices. And that's not surprising, guys.
Yeah.
Like, if you ask teachers at any time, why can't you? Why didn't? The answer is always that not enough time. I felt as though I kept saying that. I was like, I needed a T-shirt, not enough time when I was in the classroom. And so when I think about how to overcome that, one of the strategies that I found is what we talked about in our last episode about, again, if you have leadership that sort of creates a structure for you to build in that time into your day, so time to look at data, that is really helpful. And I think we mentioned this last episode, and if we didn't, they also stress that there needs to be time to look at the data, and that is separate from your planning time, your housekeeping time.
Yep.
Like time set aside for looking at the data should be separate and from all the other time, but it has to be planned, and you really need the help of your leadership to kind of have that structure built in. Yeah,
and that's what stood out to me is just if you are in a position listening to this where you can carve out some time for teachers, think of it as an investment.
Yeah.
There's a great brief by Data Quality Campaign that we'll put in the show notes. And they cite research that said a bevy of research demonstrates that when teachers are given time, context, and skills to use data, student achievement improves. And they also provide a case study of Delaware Department of Education, how they were able to carve out 90 minutes per week for educators to do these things. And it pays off on the back end. But it can't be simply just teachers do this on their own because that's going to be outside of time. Like think about the beginning of this show, it affecting sleep, and that's going to affect us elsewhere.
Right.
And Teachers Know Best did a giant study and found that the average teacher is spending 9 hours per week outside of school working. That's not going to be good for anyone. So we need to find ways as much as possible to carve out time for teachers to do this so they don't burn out. And when we can't, just think of teachers knowing who they can turn to take some things off their plate because they have so much else already on there.
It made me think that in our last episode, we talked about that shared responsibility and teachers working together, right? And so if teachers are spending 9 hours outside of school, you definitely have to find some time for them to work collaboratively, right?
Yep.
There's that time to look at data individually, and that is definitely needed, don't get me wrong. But, all of the studies show that it's more effective when we work together collaboratively on the data. So we need to have that time together and not just that time outside of school.
So you're mentioning the time should be there within the school time. So I'm just reading something here from the same article about the mindsets. And it says, even if teachers receive timely data and are skilled enough to analyze it, school culture can impede the ability to use the data effectively. And so it makes me want to know what school culture, because we're talking about time, not finding time for it, but is it that there's something about the school culture that doesn't allow for the teachers to have time to use the data as a collaborative team? So what are some of the things that we even can recall when we were in the classroom that would have impeded our time to use data as a team?
In terms of culture?
Right.
So it makes me think of when we talked about our last episode that there is that need to build that relationship, right? To have that collegiality amongst your teachers. Like that is really, really key. And so, like we mentioned the last time, you need time for that, separate again from the time to actually dive into the data. So you definitely need that culture or a climate of trust. You need that climate of collaboration. You need all of that in. And again, the word time, you need time to build that in so that you have time to work on the data.
Yeah, and I think back to that ISIL not lice kind of thing, where if the culture is you look at data to reflect on your instruction, your curriculum, and then your environment before talking about the learner,
right.
That's a culture of using data.
Right.
If, however, it's that lice, if you're starting with the learner, then the data is just going to be about labeling. That's not going to engender trust, all those things we talked about last time. That's going to be tricky. So I feel like we have a bit that's talking about what school leaders can do in terms of looking at your schedule and looking at your culture. But I don't want to, for the individual teachers there, I want to make sure that we're touching on that as well. So I was thinking just different people. So it's not just do more work at home, just who else you can kind of work with and share this load, crowdsource. So I think with your PLT, and this is where we'll drop in the show notes Richard DeFore's work and one article in particular, how PLCs do data right. So dividing up some of this with your PLT so that each of them is taking apart, you're kind of jigsawing it there. I think that can make it so it alleviates some of the issues with time. I think with your students, you can look at data notebooks, for instance. And there's some good research there on why teachers must be data experts. But also with central office, one of the advantages for our Wake County listeners is we have a lot of people like us in this room that are willing and really eager to help out and to lighten this load. So reach out to us, send us a message, and let us know how we can help out your PLT or your school. So don't feel the need to do it all and just to add more time outside of school. Find people that can lighten that load for you. Any other thoughts on the obstacle time? Because I think, as Mellisa pointed out, this is the big one.
So that overcoming part of the obstacle time, the author also suggested using protocols, because coming into that meeting without having any set expectations as to what we are going to be accomplishing, that can eat up the time, right? So it's good to have protocols, and the advice for the protocol is not to come in and check off, yes, I did that part, yes, no. Sometimes maybe just two things get covered on that protocol, but it was properly done. Like, teachers questioning each other, what did you do to make this work for your students? And questioning each other respectfully during those meetup when we're going to discuss data. But sticking to your protocol and making sure that everybody has a say at the table. And it's okay if everything on that list is not done, but at least it is meaningful. There are some expectations that are set when we're coming in to meet, and we're not going to waste time sitting at the table when we're talking about our data.
I like that.
I like that too. There are two protocols that I've found useful when looking at data, and they're from the National School Reform Faculty. The first one is called a data-driven dialogue. And the other one is called the Atlas Looking at Data. And what's important to note is when you look at both of these protocols, at least for the first couple of times, follow it to the letter.
Yeah.
Right? Because they have set times. And so the timing of it is important because, again, it allows for shared voice, but it also gives you that structure of this is how the time should flow. And so protocols, like you said, are really important. And I think those two do a really good job in terms of helping teachers have a protocol and a structure when looking at data.
Okay, so we talked about for school leaders, looking at your schedule, looking at your culture, and for teachers to crowdsource with your PLT, with central office, to bring in students into the equation and to use protocols so you're maximizing the time that you do have. The last obstacle that we want to discuss is figuring out what the next steps are when you're looking at data. And for this, EdNC, about a year or so back, surveyed over 800 teachers, and they put together a great report that we'll include in the show notes. And they found that 41% of the participants said that one of the obstacles was not being able to determine what is the most important among any available data. So figuring out what to do with it, where to go next. And this supported with a teacher data literacy brief by QC. They referenced some work done by Heppen that suggested that while teachers often do get training on how to access data systems and reports, they don't receive much, if any, in-service training on how to translate data into instructional decisions or activities in the classroom. So instead of, Mellisa, you mentioned in a previous episode, we're good at admiring data, but actually figuring out what next steps are, that can be tricky. So what do y'all think about how to figure out the next steps when you're given a lot of data?
So one of the a process that I find helpful is, again, starting off with you look at the data, you sort of kind of figure out what is the learner-centered problem. So, for example, we might look at the data and say all of the students are having problems with multi-step problems, but it can't just live there. It's moving from a learner-centered problem to then a problem of practice, and that might look like teachers then recognizing that we need to be more intentional in how we teach the strategies for multi-step problems. So again, I feel as though that is an action step. That is something that we can actually do as teachers, and then have an action plan as how we're going to do that, when we're going to incorporate those strategies. But you have to have a process to go from the learner-centered problem to the problem of practice to be able to know what are you going to do? How are you going to do something differently?
Before you even consider the next step, coming into the data meeting with a question. And yes, the question might shift as you start looking at the data. But if we have a question in mind, and this is a question that we're trying to get answered, after looking at the data, do we have the answer? And if we have the answer, then we have the next step. We know what we're going to be doing. But if you didn't have a question in mind, you just come into the meeting just saying, okay, we're just going to look and talk about what we're seeing, then that next step is lost. The next step approach should be, what were we trying to answer? Has the data provided the information that we need? Do we need to collect some more data? And if the answer is there, let's work with whatever strategy we know works best to move forward. So that's how I would say tackle the next step approach.
And that's where I think having a protocol can be really beneficial, because it's easy, especially if you only have 20 minutes to meet with your PLT. It's easy to get kind of caught in the, what am I looking at? What does it mean? That interpretation phase, and not turn that into actionable next steps. But if you have one of those protocols that Mellisa mentioned previously, and you've allocated the time, then you're going to make sure that you are getting into that, what do we do with it? Because, as Bernhardt has pointed out in Don't Just Gather Data, Use It, it's very easy to get analysis paralysis by spending time pulling data together and not spending time using the data. So we got to move by that, and that's where I think protocols can be really helpful.
Yeah. And I think, too, again, being upfront and being transparent, and again, having that culture, right? Because in order to act, like we've said before, that acting is who I am as a teacher. I need to do something differently, right? I can wish that students study more. I can wish that they did the practice. I could wish that they pay attention. But those are things that I do not usually have control over. And so that when you're thinking of the next steps, it's thinking about going in and knowing that I will probably have to do something different in my practice, in my strategies. So having that stance ahead of time is always helpful.
And that reminds me that the metaphor that strong data analysis should be more like a physical and less of an autopsy.
Yeah.
It's not looking back and labeling things that have happened, but looking forward and letting that result in some instructional changes that you can immediately put in place. So focusing on the next steps, I think, can help you get out of that analysis paralysis.
Yeah, being a detective,
Right.
I like that.
Those are a few obstacles that might and probably do pop up, but there are probably other obstacles that we haven't considered or that we might not be aware of until it comes around. So what are some thoughts on how do you adapt to unforeseen obstacles? Serena?
So prioritizing is key. The school day is busy. Things will come up. You plan was to do this after your data team meeting. I'm going to use this strategy. But things, just throw you off. With time not being your friend, you have to start prioritizing, right? So look at the pressing needs of your students and the goals you have set out to accomplish in your data team meeting. For example, if the goal was to increase your student reading proficiency by the end of the quarter, by a certain time of the year, you want to make sure that you're looking at the strategies that you and the team came up with. Am I using these strategies with fidelity? And am I throwing in anything else that is irrelevant, right? Because we're trying to prioritize here. And also making sure that as you're implementing these strategies, are you owning the data, the result? Because you're not just going to put the strategy in and not look at how it is working effectively. You're not going to wait until the end of the year to see, did the strategy work? You're going to be, revisiting the strategy, collecting some data on the strategy that you're using, and make sure that you're owning the data that goes with the result of that strategy.
Mellisa, what do you think? When unforeseen obstacles pop up, how can teachers adapt?
The best advice I got from one of my teachers is always have a plan B. Know that something will pop up.
Yeah.
So be intentional about it and plan for that, right? We've all been in teaching, and I feel as though from the minute you walk in, something is always popping up. So kind of having a plan B in your back pocket for what are you going to do if your original plan doesn't follow through would be the best advice that I think. Just be intentional about that and having sort of a backup plan for what are you going to do if your original course of action you're not able to follow through on that.
Yeah, I like that. And please don't have that backup plan B bump that time spent out of work from 9 to 10. There's just too much on teachers there. And this is where maybe that backup plan can be leaning on us as the DRA department, because we are here to help teachers work with data when these obstacles pop up. So that'd be my suggestion, is that don't put in extra time outside of work. Send us a message. Let us know how we can help you and your PLT work with your data. And you can contact us to ask for support and provide us with any other feedback or comments on this podcast or any other work at www.wcpss.net/datalit. And this brings us to a point in our Working with Data series where we're wrapping up analyzing some of these data literacy skills. And we're going to turn to some interviews that we'll conduct after the new year, talking to some different staff members within Wake County about how they work with data. Big thanks to Cary High School's Logan Foster for providing us with the theme music for this series, and also to our digital learning coordinator, Chris Zirkle, for the production assistance. Thank you all for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye.
Take care.